Faisal Devji, a renowned author, an Oxford scholar, and a senior faculty member, joins us online from London. Faisal's latest book, Waning, Crescent, and the Rise and Fall of Islam is in news these days. His scholarship helps us with deeper understanding of Islam as we see it today. Islam could be understood in multiple ways: civilizationally, ideologically, and as an identity. Faisal, a very warm welcome to you on our show, The Searchlight.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Likewise, to have you with us. So, to put things in perspective, let me begin by asking you to, for the sake of the readers who have not yet seen your book, how do you explain the title of your book, Waning Crescent, The Rise and Fall of Islam?
It's the rise and fall of global Islam, I should
That's
say.
right, yes.
The title comes from my interest in the fact that from around the middle of the 19th century into our own times, Muslim thinkers around the world have conceptualized the end of Islam. And by end, I don't mean simply the decline of Islam, but perhaps also its fulfillment. And this way of thinking about Islam in a profane, if not secular way, is, I think, quite new. So in the past, of course, you had these visions or ideas of the end of time. The apocalypse will come, the Mahdi will return, all things will come to an end. But from the middle of the 19th century, Muslim thinkers start imagining Islam's end as a result of the failure of Muslims themselves to live up to its ideals, that it will end in history just as it arose in history. And this, as I said, profane, if not secular understanding of Islam's decline is what gave me the title that I use for my book. So it's not me making the case that Islam is waning, as the title puts it, waning crescent, but rather I'm looking at the way in which Muslim thinkers have over the last 150, 200 years imagined the decline of Islam, why they thought it was declining, and what they thought should be done about this decline.
Today, when we say Islam has assumed an identity or say a character, which identity are we talking about?
Well, look, I mean, there is a long history, as you know, that goes back nearly 2000 years now. And that is not something I'm particularly interested in. I'm not qualified to talk about early Islam, nor am I particularly interested in it. I'm interested in modern history. I'm a modern historian. So what I do in this book is show how Islam assumes a new aspect and a new demeanor in modern times. And my argument is that with the rise of European empires in Asia and Africa, you have the diminution of Muslim forms of traditional authority, both royal authority, political authority, and, if you will, theological, clerical, or saintly authority as well. And it's in that context that these Muslim thinkers, whom I was referring to earlier, come to imagine Islam as a subject in its own right. So once you have the alleged failure of kings and clerics and Sufi saints, or at least the loss of their power, relatively speaking, you have emerging in their place, in the place of their renounced authority, Islam itself, as if it were a subject in its own right. It can act, it can will, it can have ideals, it can do things. And Muslims are encouraged to relate themselves directly to this thing called Islam, which, as I'm saying, was understood in a quite novel and original way from the middle of the 19th century. So it is Islam that becomes a subject. Suddenly, Muslim thinkers start saying things like, Islam wants you to do X, Y, or Z. Islam has certain ideals. Islam has made such and such a thing possible. It was unlikely that Muslims in the past could have uttered these kinds of statements, could have imagined that Islam was a subject. And Islam only becomes a subject of this kind, a global subject, as I argue, with the decline of kingship and clerical authority and saintly authority. And what that decline ensures is the rise of new kinds of Muslim elites and new kinds of Muslim thinkers. So the new middle classes who are produced by colonial rule, new kinds of religious entrepreneurs, all kinds of people suddenly emerge and claim to speak in the name of Islam. And they put down or criticize the older authorities who had once spoken as Muslim authorities, primarily, as I keep saying, kings and princes and clerics and Sufis. So this is the historical context from the 19th century, from its mid to late point, that I argue gives rise to Islam as a new kind of global subject. You can imagine it as if it were a person, except, of course, it is not understood as a person even in the abstract sense. As you point out in your introduction, what I say in the book is that from the 19th century, Islam is imagined to be a civilization. It acts as a civilization acts. Uh, in the 20th century, especially during the Cold War, in the midpoint of the 20th century, for Islamists, especially, Islam comes to be seen as an ideology, nazariya, right, in Urdu. This is how Maududi conceptualized it. It's an ideology in the same way as capitalism and communism were ideologies, and all of these are understood as abstract agents, as subjects that act in their own right in their own name. And then at the end of the 20th century, in the early 21st century, in the period defined by neoliberalism, it comes to be understood, especially in diasporic spaces in the West, as an identity. Islam becomes an identity in the time of identity politics more generally. So, what I'm doing in this book is saying there is a specific history to the development of Islam as a subject, as a global subject, from the 19th century to our own time. But that history is also part of a general history. So Islam doesn't look so peculiar. In the 19th century, it is understood as a civilization, just like European civilizations are understood or other Asian and African ones. In the middle of the 20th century, it becomes understood by Islamists anyway and by modernists as an ideology. And in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, it often is understood as an identity. So these are different ways in which Muslims try to conceptualize Islam. And of course, they claim to be faithful to the past that you refer to, the medieval past. And there are certain continuities, but there are many changes as well. And as a historian, I'm interested not in the continuities, but in the ruptures, in the changes. All religions and other forms of tradition, whatever their continuities, are also subject to many different kinds of changes and developments. And it's those changes that really lend these traditions their novel character in modern times.
Right. So let's get into a bit of specifics from what you've said. When we talk about the absence of the patronage of the, say, the kings, the clerics, or the mystics in the by the 19th century, what impact or what difference do you see if we talk about specifically about the Indian subcontinent? How did it pan out in this region?
Well, India is actually one of the earliest places these developments occur in. Not accidentally, because India is colonized quite early on, uh, compared to, say, much of sub Saharan Africa. To say nothing of places in the Middle East like the Ottoman Empire, where it's only after the First World War that countries that become Syria and Iraq are put under European colonial rule. Of course, before that, the Ottoman government itself had Europeanized, and so was using many of the same intellectual and bureaucratic um, measures and instruments in its own empire as the Europeans did in their empires. Let's not forget the Ottoman Empire was also a European empire in many respects. But India is important because already by the 18th century and in some places earlier, you really have Muslim and Hindu and Jain and Sikh and other thinkers uh, having to they feel compelled uh, to try to imagine a future in what appears to be very new circumstances, where they no longer control the politics of their country or of their regions. And this leads to many different kinds of developments, some of which are comparable, others of which are not. So, in the case of Indian Muslims, for instance, the diminution of royal authority in a way means the proliferation of clerical authority. Right? So, in one sense, clerical authority declines because clerics are no longer linked to political power in the same way as they had been in the past. On the other hand, the fact that the kings are no longer either in place or able to enforce their authority means that clerics can escape the control of kings and they can just move across Muslim society and take over the kind of authority that had once either been confined to kings and princes, uh, uh, or the royal authority embodied by kings and princes had kept the clerics in check. So, you see the spread of madrasas and madrasa education and all the rest only um, really speed up after the mutiny of 1857. Right? The creation of Deoband, and then, of course, the creation of Aligarh as well. So you have both the clerical classes and the new Muslim middle classes, the modernists or the liberals, whatever you wish to call them, expanding at the same time. And both of them criticize earlier forms of authority. So they think that the kings and princes of the past had been derelict in their duties, they had become decadent, and they were unable to protect Muslim society. And so you needed to replace these failed authorities. Of course, the modernists or liberals thought that the clerics had similarly failed in their duties, and therefore you needed new intellectuals, new kinds of intellectuals who are no longer ulama, to take Islam in hand and reinterpret Islam. And that is of course, the task of figures like Sayyid Ahmed Khan and others. So India really becomes a laboratory for rethinking what Islam might mean in modern times.
Right. Faisal, would you agree that you mentioned about Ottoman Empire? Would you agree that the Khilafat movement, it played in fact, almost the biggest role in consolidation of Muslim identity in India, or, rather seeing Islam as an ideology and later as identity?
Well, Khilafat is interesting. I mean, it emerges only at the end of the First World War. Um, and it's interesting because you're right in that it represents the biggest mobilization of Muslims in Indian history, across the board, across sectarian divides. Uh, Also crucial, of course, is to note that the Khilafat movement is placed under the leadership of a Hindu, of Mahatma Gandhi. That too is really very unusual. Elsewhere, I have compared Khilafat to the mutiny or the Indian rebellion, whatever you wish to call it, because there too you have the coming together of two religious communities under the leadership of, in this case, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor. And the Khilafat agitation was often compared by the British to the mutiny. It frightened them. And also, they had not seen the coming together of Hindus and Muslims in this manner since 1857. So, Khilafat has a certain kind of genealogy that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. The people who really dislike it, of course, are in the Muslim League. So when in the 1930s the Muslim League starts gaining popularity with the decline of Khilafat, they continuously attack Khilafat as representing the loss of Muslim independence or autonomy or sovereignty. And so it's very interesting. But it's from Khilafat that you have the wholesale mobilization of Muslims in public life for the first time really since 1857.
Right. Let me now go back to your, you know, uh, the argument about, you know, how Islam has changed in historical context, and it was first seen as an civilization, then ideology, and now as identity. So I want to understand from you, how do you see Islam as an identity panning out in the unipolar and the multipolar world?
Well, I mean, I don't know. One of the things my book suggests is that uh, we might be coming to the end of Islam's career as a global subject, right? That the kind of thing I described when I said that, people from the middle of the 19th century could start making statements like Islam wants you to do something, or Islam says that you should do something, or believe something, or Islam acts in the world. That way of thinking about Islam as a subject, as if it were a person, um, it really doesn't any longer seem to be that important in the mobilizations we have seen of Muslims in the recent past. Right? This has nothing to do with whether these people in these mobilizations are believers or unbelievers or whatever. They might be very pious Muslims, but they no longer refer to Islam in their political and social mobilizations at all. And that I think is really quite fascinating. Whether it is the so-called Arab Spring protests, the various protests in Iran from the Green Movement onwards, the Masa Amini protests, recent events like the fall of the Bangladeshi government, all kinds of examples of Muslim mass mobilization no longer really make use of Islam as a subject. And that, I think, really signals another kind of transformation. So, what I suggest in the book is that you have this arc of Muslim global subjectivity from the middle to late 19th century until the early 21st century. What comes after, I don't know, I cannot tell, but surely something is happening. And we need to attend to Muslim thinkers and the mobilizations that I described to understand what's happening. Are we seeing the return of a new kind of politics or a new kind of theology? It's unclear. But I should note one thing here that when I speak of Islam as a subject in its own right, as an agent, one of the implications of that, of course, is the displacement of the traditional theological agency of God and of the Prophet. Right? So not only are kings and ulama and Sufis displaced to some degree, although, as I said, the ulama proliferate also in this period. The Sufis do not. In our times, you seem to be seeing a kind of return of Sufi orders in some parts of the world. So that's interesting. But for me, intellectually, what's interesting is that all the people who went on and on about Islam, Islam wants you to do things, Islam is an ideal, they spoke of Islam much more than they spoke of God. And
Yes.
that is not my discovery. An important scholar already in the 1950s, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, already makes this point very briefly. He says when you look at the Quran and early Muslim texts, the word God, Allah, uh, is present many thousands of times more than the word Islam. Like in the Quran, Islam is only there a couple of times, right? Uh, but in modern times, he says, the position is reversed. That Muslim thinkers and writers keep talking about Islam all the time, but they talk about God much less. So
Yes. Very
Islam has
interesting.
literally replaced God and in some ways replaced the Prophet. And so God and the Prophet become problems for Muslim thinking in this period. It's not like they don't believe in God or the Prophet, obviously,
Right.
they do. But once Islam comes to be imagined as the subject of history,
Right.
then what do you make of God or the Prophet? And it's in this context that I argue in my book that these new mobilizations, starting already in Bombay in 1850,
Right.
over insults to the Prophet, so called blasphemy mobilizations, start emerging precisely because the Prophet has been displaced and removed as an authority. He needs to be protected. He's become vulnerable in new ways, and he's protected in new ways, uh, sometimes through violence. God too becomes a kind of semi-invisible figure in Muslim debates around this time, and these are, very believing and pious Muslims as well as people who might not be so believing or pious. They share the same kind of narrative. Uh, and God's disappearance is really fascinating because it is envisaged through the return of idolatry in a new way. So in the past, for instance, you had God and you have idols, right? These are the two opposing categories. There's a real God, according to Muslims, and then there are false gods. When you come to modern times, it's no longer actual idols that are important for Muslim thought. It is, in fact, systems, abstractions, abstract subjects, just like Islam. So, for instance, this is, Maududi, nationalism is idolatry, monarchy is idolatry, all kinds of abstract systems, abstract agencies are understood as idols. The other of these idols is no longer God. The other is Islam. All right. So God has disappeared in this manner also. So modern Muslim thought has struggled with the disappearance of traditional understandings of both God and Muhammad. So if we have reached the end of that arc of Muslim global subjecthood, it makes me wonder whether we have before us, a kind of re-theologization and a return of God and the Prophet, and for the Shias, Imams, etc., and Sufi saints to Muslim life and practice. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yes, that's a very interesting observation, which comes through in your book that, but the center of Islam, Allah and Prophet Muhammad have been relegated to the background somewhere. Uh, Another interesting thing which comes from this, of what you've just said, is, that there were figures like Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, who also led to politicization of Islam in a way, in a big way actually, and that has led to Islam becoming an identity, and this identity has made the Muslims look inwards. If you add to it what you've said, that the decline of the authority and this inward looking trend, how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about identity is that, um, I mean, I look at it in a couple of chapters, one of which has to do with gender, with the making of the Muslim woman as a subject. Like for a long time, women were not understood as fully Muslim. They were understood as being you know, uh, uh, prey to pagan habits and practices and things like that. And therefore, in the 19th century, precisely, you have these movements of reform, right? Both among the ulama and among the modernists of Aligarh. Women needed to be educated and they need to be literate and they need to learn how to manage their households. And a lot of this is about female labor. How do you, as the poet Akbar Ilahabadi very amusingly describes, he describes the whole process of women's reform as a way in which these new middle classes among Muslims can draw upon female labor and do without servants and things like that. In these new bungalows in which they lived, no longer, these havelis with zananas and all the rest. So uh, there's that aspect of it as well. But that's so one chapter in which I write about gender in the making of the Muslim subject, of Muslim identity understood in a new way. And women become ideal Muslims in a way precisely because they are seen as being obedient, whereas men are not as trustworthy. So it's an interesting thing that happens. But the other chapter in which I look at how Islam becomes identity is when I write about 21st century militancy. And in particular, the shift between from Al Qaeda to ISIS and what that indicates. And there you have a really perverse vision of identity because the anxiety is that Muslim individuals, uh, have their own interests and ideas, and in that sense, their own sovereignty, which is autonomous of or distinct from Islam. And the point, therefore, is to make sure that there is no distinction between Islam as a global subject and the Muslim individual as someone who represents Islam. And in a way, the Al Qaeda version of this uh, effort to break down individual autonomy and inwardness uh, and break down any separation between the individual and Islam as the true subject of history is thought about in terms of sacrifice, right? So the suicide bomber as the chief iconic figure of Al Qaeda is someone who, the moment he exercises sovereign agency in killing people, must also kill himself. Therefore, the suicide bombing and the narrative produced by the suicide bomber in it's mostly his because they're mostly men in these videotape testaments, etc., is sacrificial. So the moment of uh, individual agency is also the moment of its ending, right? Therefore, it must be Islam that is the only subject. With ISIS, you move to a different way of thinking about this relationship, and that is as virtuality, where it's no longer the suicide bomber who is important. It is the virtual actor in these staged spectacles of violence, of brutal violence and murder, where these people are shown not as sacrificing, but as enjoying the violence that they perpetrate. And that, I argue, is meant to display their complete evisceration of inner life of any individual autonomy. They simply become playthings of Islam as the true global subject. They are simply subjects of the law. They simply put it into effect. And so you have these two ways in militancy of rehearsing identity not as subjectivity or subjecthood, but as the end or the resignation of subjectivity, because Islam must be the only subject. So when I talk about identity, I'm talking about that. I'm not talking about the making of an autonomous, distinct Muslim subject. So on the one hand, to repeat, women become ideal Muslim subjects because of their obedience. Uh, uh, their non-sovereign capacities. Uh, and in a completely different way, among the 21st century militants, you have men becoming subjects, or I should say, desubjectified by the canceling out of their agency, by their obedience, but obedience exercised in a very different direction.
Right. In your book, you brought out a very interesting, difference or distinction between the way Mir and Hali have perceived Islam. Can you just talk us through, how did it, occur to you to bring out this difference?
Well, I was thinking of, how do I write an introduction that, very quickly encapsulates my initial argument. And I thought that, counterposing, juxtaposing, I should say, these two short pieces of poetry would be a good way of doing so. And Mir, of course, is the famous 18th century poet of Delhi, who, and this was very commonplace at the time, when he uses the term Islam, uh, he does so infrequently because Islam is not a particularly uh, common word in this kind of poetry, in this case, the ghazal tradition, which is the most extensive poetic tradition in Persian and Urdu and Turkish and other Muslim languages. Uh, and often it's used critically, as it is in this couplet from Mir that I deploy, where for him Islam is simply, one element. He talks about deen and mazhab, and he talks about Islam, and Islam is simply one in this list. It's the most particularistic form. It represents just practices. So for him, Islam just means people doing things like going to the mosque or fasting, or it's a set of practices. It doesn't mean anything more than that. And so I use that share to point out that in the in the 18th century and the earlier bit of the 19th century, in something like the Urdu poetic tradition, Islam is deployed very differently than it is later on. It is not the name of a religion necessarily. It is not a system. It is not a Nazariya. It is not a subject, an actor in its own right. It is not the name under which you can encompass everything, right? All Muslim practices are put under the heading of Islam. That's not true in Mir. There is Deen and there is Mazhab and there is Islam, and they are related to each other, but they're not the same thing. It's not like Deen and Mazhab go under Islam.
Right.
By the time you move to Hali, his famous poem, the Musaddas, the Madod Jazre Islam, Islam is in the title. And Islam is everywhere in that uh, epic poem. Now, it's a different genre. It's not the ghazal, obviously. It's a Musaddas. Uh, but in the past, the Musaddas had not really included Islam as such a subject either. So this is quite new, what Hali is doing. And by Hali's time, only 40 odd years after Mir's death, Islam has become a subject of this kind. The Musaddas, the title is, it evokes or goes back to my title, the title of my book, the, the flow and ebb of Islam. He's talking about the decline of Islam. Baddo Jazra Islam. That's what it is. I use waning crescent. Hali's metaphor is a maritime metaphor, right? It's the sea that ebbs and flows. I use a lunar metaphor, the moon, but the moon and the sea are connected because, of course, the waning and waxing of the tides is linked to the moon and the phases of the moon, the waning and waxing of the moon. So that is the most direct connection that I draw between my title and Hali's title, right? To
Correct.
show that it is Muslim thinkers who are imagining Islam in this way. For Amir, the fact that someone might repudiate Islam is neither here nor there, right? In his couplet, he says, I've been sitting in the temple and I've put kashka on my forehead, sandalwood paste, and I'm sitting in a temple and I have long abandoned Islam. When he says that, he doesn't mean that Islam is declining. He might even be suggesting that religious truth is universal and that you can get in a temple as well as in a mosque, right? It doesn't really matter. So Islam is not understood historically as a subject in the process of decline. For Hali, on the other hand, it's all about decline. It's all about Islam. It has become a subject. Everything like Deen and Mazhab is now attributed to Islam, is placed under the heading of Islam. And he worries about the decline of Islam itself. And in that famous poem, he goes on about the failure of kings and the failure of clerics and the failure of Sufis, and everyone fails. Right? And then he thinks about how you might revive Islam. So it becomes a completely different kind of term. So I thought that putting these two bits of verse side by side, they're composed, within half a century of each other in the same city. Hali is from Panipat, but he happened to be in Delhi, I think, when he wrote his Musaddas. Gives us a perfect illustration of how, in a few decades, the understanding of Islam has changed radically. Now, these are not the only two ways in which you can understand Islam, but I didn't want to go through an illustration of every way in which Islam was understood. These are the ones that are crucial for my argument, and so I deal with them.
Right. Very interesting. Now, could you take us through the process of research of your book? How long did it take? Uh, what was the exercise like?
Well, I've been thinking about it for many years, and there are a couple of chapters in there which, some versions of which have been published before in edited volumes and things, and I expanded upon those articles and included them in the book. Most of it was written afresh, but the themes I've been, mulling over for many years now. And I finally decided that I wanted to bring all of these thoughts together. So, because I've been thinking of them for a while, it didn't take me that long to write. I'd already gone over many of these texts that I cite. And as you may be aware, I have earlier work. My first two books were on Al Qaeda and global militancy. So I already had a background in that field that I could bring to bear in this book. My earliest work, in fact, when I was a student, was on the Muslim women's reform movements. So my PhD thesis at the University of Chicago was on the Aligarh movement. And in that thesis, I really spent a lot of time. It was in the early 1990s on people like Deputy Nazir Ahmed and Hali and Sar Sayed and all of these people who wrote about Sheikh Abdullah, Begum Abdullah, all the usual people you think about when you think about Muslim women's reform. So that chapter came out of my earliest academic work from when I was a student at the University of Chicago. Um, and then, so I basically brought together interests that I've had for a long time. Some interests I had abandoned along on the wayside, and I returned to them, like this Muslim women's movement, reform movement. Others are more recent. So I've been writing about Maududi and Khomeini more recently, and I put Maududi together with Khomeini as my two important examples of Islamist thinkers. Uh, but it's important to note, though you might read the book as a critique, it is in a sense, but it is actually a history of Muslim thinking about Islam uh, since the middle of the 19th century. Not all Muslim thinking about Islam. So I really am focusing only on the movements and the intellectuals I think of as truly global in their reach. Right?
Right.
So these are basically the modernists or the liberals, such as the Aligarhists, the Islamists, as we call them now, such as the Maududis and the Sayyid Qutbs and the Khomeinis, and these more briefly, these 21st century militants like Al Qaeda and ISIS. And those are the three movements I really look at. I'm not looking so much as the Sufis or the ulama. Other people work on these categories of people. They are not particularly global necessarily. And so I cite them here and there, but I don't focus on them. So it's, the book is a history of Muslim understandings of Islam, and it's not meant to be dismissive of anyone or approving of anyone else. I hope it is as neutral and even po-faced as it can be.
Right. Now, what was your biggest discovery, or say, let's say, takeaway while writing this book? Was there any one thing which you said was a real discovery? Because your book covers a wide expanse of Muslims, Islam, and their interaction with the rest of the world. What was one discovery which you had while writing this book?
It's difficult to say. I suppose, when I returned to subjects with which I thought I was familiar, like this whole debate over women's education and women's reform, I was surprised when I returned to these debates because when I reread some of these texts, I ended up approaching them quite differently than the way I'd done so in the past. And so that was a kind of, if you will, inner surprise. I thought I knew what this set of debates was about, but I was forced to rethink them. And of course, that was a result of the many years I've spent as a historian since my early days as a student. So I've hopefully learned something in that period of time, which made me revisit and rethink um, some of these issues. Um, Also, when I was writing about figures like Maududi and Khomeini, whom I've dealt with before, and Iqbal to some degree, um, you know, I think I came to understand the complexity of their thoughts better than I had done so before. And they are formidable thinkers, these people. I may or may not agree with everything they say or anything they say. But these are not minor figures. They're important figures. So I was basically, I suddenly found myself understanding why someone like Maududi remains, and the Jamaat-e-Islami remains an important intellectual vehicle for Muslims in the subcontinent, especially. And that doesn't mean that uh, all the Muslims who engage with Maududi or the Jamaat
Yeah.
are themselves Jamaatis or agree with everything either that Maududi said or the Jamaat said, but Maududi and the Jamaat represent an intellectual tradition which remains one of the few available that is a modern intellectual tradition capable of dealing both with traditional discussions and debates among the ulama, etc., and, if you will, modern European, Western. And there are not that many movements that are capable of doing this. So I think Islamism, as I argue in the book, in general, is in a state of severe decline. And its moment has passed. It's really a Cold War project, as was Maududi's project. But the intellectual tradition they set up, may continue in different ways. So I find that to be, I was surprised by that, let's say. So these are, there's no one big moment of revelation, uh, but these are among the ways in which I surprised myself when
Right.
doing my research and writing, even though I didn't expect to be surprised.
Right. Faisal, thank you so much for taking the time and being with us. Thank you very much, and we highly recommend Faisal's book, Waning Crescent, The Rise and Fall of Global Islam, to our readers. Do go and pick up a copy of the book or order it online. I guess it's coming to India very soon. It's not available in India as of now. So,
Yes, sadly, it's only available in the British or the American edition.
right. So Indians would look forward to your, reading your book, this book as well. So thank you very much, Faisal, for being with us.
Thank you very much for speaking with me.